This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at Kevin Kautzman and at Brad Kelly. We're back with Art of Darkness. Kevin Kautzman here in the great state of Minnesota, the city of St. Paul, with Brad Kelly. Brad, how are you?
I'm doing great, man. How are you?
Yeah, just had a wedding upstate. My
lockdown is over.
Lockdown is done.
Yeah,
we're done.
What is that John Lennon? War is over if you want it. Lockdown is over if you want it.
Lockdown is over if you want it, and we want it, and we never want it back again.
That's right.
Yeah.
So that's good. That's good. I'm glad. That sounds fun.
I got to put some duds on. I got dapper. I'm a Dapper Dan man.
That's
put on some
fun.
My finest pomade, and we have one for you coming up soon too.
Yeah. 6 weeks or. Too soon for me to think about.
Yeah,
so,
right. Well, it's June 2021, but these are evergreen episodes of our show about the dark side of artists and creatives. And on this episode, Brad is taking the helm. Brad, who are we talking about today?
We're talking about the one and only Rod Serling.
Rod Serling. Now, when you first said the name to me, I had no idea who you were talking about.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was surprised. I guess I was surprised by that, but you know. I never know. I always assume that everybody has the same cultural references I do. So,
right.
You know.
I was late to get into Led Zeppelin. I should have been a Led Zeppelin fan early in my 20s, but it was only in the latter half that I even started to get it. You never know.
Fair enough. Well, what do you, Kevin, as our tradition requires, what do you know about Rod Serling?
Well, I didn't go in entirely blind here, so I know that Rod Serling, from our conversations, was the creator of... What is it? How does it go?
I can't do it.
The Twilight Zone.
The Twilight Zone. I don't think that's the theme music exactly, but we'll let it stand.
I know that was something, but it was maybe the Batman theme music a little bit.
Yeah, that was a little bit of the Batman theme. That's all right. It's the same era. It's the same exact
classic television. I'm going to confess that I am not a Twilight Zone guy. Okay. I'm willing to be convinced, but you don't get. What is it? Black Mirror. Yeah. You don't get X-Files. No. You don't get Twin Peaks. All this high weirdness.
Oh yeah, not to mention like Outer Limits. There's a whole bunch of anthology shows in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and all throughout. So not that X-Files was an anthology show, but they had their Monster of the Week episodes. So definitely, and the making space for the weird in television is sort of what the Twilight Zone did. So yeah, even if it doesn't really, you aren't as fond of the old episodes as I am, they still mark an important place in the history of television, and I feel like this is the most sort of pop culture figure we've done so far.
I think so. I mean, Oscar Wilde is sort of pop culture in his time, but this is Americana, high Americana.
Yes.
And of course, I'm very curious about, because this is a show about the dark side of artists and their sort of weirder, freakier side, and I assume a fellow who made a show such as this had a bit of a quirky life. So I'm very curious.
Yeah, no, there's it's relevant for our show, that's for sure. So we'll get into it a little bit. As we mentioned, Rod Serling, most famous for the Twilight Zone. I should say he not only created it and produced it, was the host and sort of face of the Twilight Zone, it being an anthology series.
Oh, that's the guy. So the guy who comes on and says the famous lines. Yeah, what is the line? We're something?
Yeah. There's a dimension beyond space and time. I actually have it like written out here.
All right.
Because he has a great, in my opinion, a fantastic voice. And he talked in this very clipped, very kind of stylized fashion. So he became known for that, and as we'll find out, I mean, he was the most famous writer in America for a while.
Whoa.
because he was also the face of this television show, right? And he wrote the vast majority of the Twilight Zone episodes. A lot of people thought that he was just sort of the creator, an actor that they'd hired to bring out to the front, but he was actually the sort of creative engine behind the whole thing.
The bulk of the series, dude.
The bulk of the series, dude. Yeah, exactly. I just watched Big Lebowski last night.
All right.
Yeah. So literally, when I saw that scene, I was like, "Oh yeah, Rod Serling."
Yeah.
Same
the
deal.
bulk of the series.
Bulk of the series.
That's a great scene.
It is. So Rod Serling, born Christmas Day of 1924 in Syracuse, New York. He was the younger brother by 6 years, and he would eventually grow up in Binghamton, New York, which, if I'm not mistaken, is Camille Paglia territory.
Yeah, she's from the snow belt up there.
She's from down there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we're down in it's not quite upstate New York. It's still, I guess, central New York, but it's almost Pennsylvania, to be honest. It's right down there near the border.
Anything that is north of Yonkers or west of Yonkers is upstate New York.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So, I'm going to talk about his parents a little bit, because I think there's a lot of important, just like all of these artists, there's a lot of important context for the people and the places that they're from. And I think we'll see that place is just as important in Serling's life as any of the people we've talked about so far. But first, I want to talk a little bit about his father, Samuel Serling, who's a pretty interesting guy. Samuel Serling was the child of Jewish Lithuanian immigrants, actually, in Detroit, which is interesting to me because I don't know of any Lithuanian community here whatsoever. So I'm kind of curious about, why were they here? But nevertheless, he was a tinkerer, and he probably would have been an engineer if he had the opportunity to. But interestingly, what he did to try and Samuel Serling, what he did to get money was he became a secretary. He went to secretary school, which basically no men did at this time in the 19 teens. There was, there were as rare as women owning businesses were male secretaries, essentially. He met a woman in Auburn, New York, Esther Cooper, who was a Russian-born daughter of Lithuanian immigrants, and they would eventually become married. So Serling is the offspring of two Lithuanians, essentially. There was some struggles early on because Esther came from literally from an Orthodox family, and there were concerns about, and Samuel Serling was nowhere near Orthodox, so there were definitely concerns about, this marriage. However, Samuel Serling, much like his son Rod Serling, was super charismatic, impossible not to like, and could basically just talk anybody into anything he wanted.
And this is the guy who wanted to be a secretary?
Yes. Yeah. Well, he for whatever reason, and well, actually the reason he became a secretary was because he'd been working all these menial jobs, and then he went into a business and he saw a secretary like making actual decisions. And he's like, well, if I can't go to school and I can't afford to become an engineer, I can't do these other things, I need to do something where at least I get to make a decision.
Gee whiz, I'm going to learn how to type.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah. So, for what it's worth. Now, so he talks Esther's father into it being okay that they get married. He says he's going to keep a kosher house, and then from there on, he basically never mentions anything about Judaism again. Now, the one thing that he does do is Esther's father runs a chain of grocery stores, and Samuel Serling eventually talks him into letting him run one, and then eventually runs his own down in Binghamton, where Rod is eventually born. But there is a detour along the way, and I find this fascinating. So the Panama Canal was getting built at this time, right? Samuel Serling, obsessed with the Panama Canal, just as an engineer, tinkery kind of guy. He talked himself into getting a job as a secretary to an engineer working on the Panama Canal. He did not tell his wife until literally the night after they got married that that's where they were going to go.
Oh, wow.
So he took her on a honeymoon to Panama, and they came back 6 years later.
Holy moly. All right.
Yeah. So anyway, so they come back. She's pregnant with Rod's older brother, and then a few years later we get Rod. Now, Rod is Rod is an incredibly charismatic person. Everybody loves him from the time he's a little kid. Chatty, talkative, kind of handsome, just eminently likable. And he's in this town, Binghamton. Binghamton is actually pretty fascinating. I dug into the history of this a little bit. It was like a melting pot of European ethnic minorities, Russians, Polish, Jews, Jews from those places, but also non-Jews from those places, Czech. Right. And so, it doesn't really match what we would call diversity now, but for the time, it was a pretty diverse place.
Are these principally Ellis Island people, or a little before that?
Yeah, okay. There was a time where people would come over Ellis Island, and they would ask which way to EJ. And what EJ was Endicott Johnson, a boot and shoe manufacturer in Binghamton, New York.
Huh.
And the George Johnson who ran Endicott Johnson was like this, by all accounts, like legitimately benevolent capitalist mogul guy. He took extremely good care of his personnel. They all kind of tightened their belts when the Great Depression happened. So basically everybody got through and you didn't have to lay anybody off.
I'm just recoiling with skepticism as you say this.
I know. And I actually went on like a sidetrack. I was like, is it really? And everything I found, it seemed legitimate. So
well, there used to be a sense of noblesse oblige.
Sure. Right.
This wasn't the gig economy at the time.
Right.
We're going to take care of our boys, and they're going to take care of their families, and we're going to get through. Gosh darn it, this is America.
Right. Exactly.
Now it's just like, you have 5 jobs and no health care. Now who needs it?
Right. Yeah. I mean, we got people who technically work for a near trillionaire who don't get bathroom breaks. So, anyway, and part of this is not only economically, it was a pretty good place to live, but because everybody was so new to it. There were so many immigrants and they were all desperate to assimilate. There was actually a fair amount of like racial harmony, right? There wasn't the kind of conflicts you expect could happen in an environment like this. Right. And it would actually create the setting, the idyllic American utopia that we imagine, when we think back, or when trads think back, they think this is what a small town could have been like. It seems like Binghamton sort of was like that. And Rod Serling certainly remembered Binghamton.
A little bit of a Norman Rockwell. We all pull together. We're all Americans now.
Yeah.
The excitement of being in America. We've left the old world behind, and now it's nothing but promise.
Right. And if we just work hard and we're honest and we take care of each other, we're all gonna make it. Yeah. That's right. Now, which is kind of beautiful. I mean, it's so nice. It sounds cheesy, but really, like, what's wrong with that, right? And so this setting, this setting ends up engendering these themes that come up in Serling's work again and again. So the small town thing, he was also, because he's going to survive through the McCarthy era, right? He's certainly not a communist, and he really valued like business and understood what they were trying to do because he'd seen this Endicott Johnson thing, I think, and he thought, well, business can do great things, right? We can all like team up and have this great world together. And, people get to make money, and you get to drive a big fancy car if you work hard enough and all of that. So that kind of thing shows through in his work and his life. So one thing I want to do, because the Twilight Zone to me is fascinating. I absolutely loved it as a kid, and watched a few of them recently in preparation for this. And I don't want to say it holds up exactly, because there's no TV from the early 60s is really going to hold up, right? It's just the technology is too off, the timing is all wonky and whatever. But what I will say is, like, they still kind of work, I guess. They're entertaining, they're interesting. The acting is halfway decent some of the times. The dialogue is pretty good. The plot is almost always kind of ironic and a little bit of a thinker as far as like mainstream TV goes. So I'm going to just pepper in some premises. Is that the plural of premise?
Premises.
Premises. Yeah, got it.
Premises.
Got it.
I don't know. Yeah.
Nailed it.
Yeah, right.
So, and so I want to talk about a couple episodes that really drive home this small town thing for Serling. So, one of the first episodes is an episode called Walking Distance. Walking Distance, a 36-year-old man, Martin Sloan, an exhausted NYC ad exec. Half of the stuff Serling wrote was about like an exhausted ad executive for some reason, but it was like the prototypical man. Everybody was a 35-year-old ad executive.
Yeah, a little bit of a Mad Men archetype. I work on Madison Avenue and I'm in advertising, but I live in the suburbs and I've got my wife and my 2 kids and my dog Fitz and we're all
right. And so he would talk often about how that the jadedness that you can arrive at in that lifestyle, right? So you've got this ad executive, he's driving cross country he stops and he realizes on his road trip he's very near his childhood hometown. So he decides he's just going to walk there. I don't remember if his car broke down or what. And when he gets there, the town is exactly the town it was when he was a little boy. So he goes into a drugstore and he has an ice cream soda and he has all these memories of his past and he talks, he remembers these people and these things. And it's this very idyllic, like, the 50s postcard kind of world. Eventually this guy runs into his parents in this previous time. He's trying to convince his parents that he is their son. He succeeds only in proving his insanity. Martin tries to warn his younger self to enjoy his childhood before it is too late, but his advances scare young Martin, who falls off the merry-go-round and injures his leg. Finally, the father confronts him. Having seen the papers in Martin's wallet and now believing him to be who he says he is, he tells him to return to his own time, in which Martin finds himself walking with a new limp. So this is like a very classic Twilight Zone sort of setup. There's this like ironic twist at the end where like, well, it could have all been a dream, but yet there's this thing that is carried across, right? And of course, you've got the small town thing, which was big for him.
When did the show premiere?
1959.
59. All right. Yeah, so we're into the beats in New York are happening, but it's not quite yet the Beatles.
Right.
Elvis.
1959 to 1965.
All right.
Yeah. Okay. So you got post Hiroshima, like paranoia, Cold War-ish stuff happening. It's a very Korea. Yeah. And it's one of the most popular shows on TV during that time. So you can imagine it fits right in there to the
we're in a 60s. Weird new place now. Something is like a metaphor for the general kind of uneasiness and American paranoia.
Yeah, I think so. I never thought that when I was watching it as a kid, but now I totally do.
Yeah. Well, so at the time, was it ABC, CBS, NBC? Was it still the big three? Or
basically, yeah. There was CBS was what Twilight Zone was on, but early on, especially, this was starting to change when the Twilight Zone came on because Twilight Zone was all filmed. That is, it was like recorded video, whereas 10 years before that, almost everything you saw on TV was actually going to be live. Just for
now, it's the Dick Van Dyke Show.
right. Just for technological reasons, it took them a while to figure out how to do it. But because of this, oftentimes the East Coast and the West Coast had totally different programming. You could have, at one point, Serling works for a Cincinnati station, and he's writing all of the content for the Cincinnati station. Like he's writing a sitcom, like a dramatic show, and he's writing commercials, and it just worked very differently back then. And these were shows that you would only see in Cincinnati, right? So it's kind of strange. So talking a little bit, I don't want to spend too much time in his childhood. I mean, I kind of already said how well liked he was. He was talkative, intelligent, charismatic, maybe extremely so. It turns out that he would be very short. I couldn't get a fixed number, but the impression I got was something around 5'4" was his height. He was a short guy, which bothered him, which made him not popular with the girls, though he probably otherwise would have been. So instead of being
5'4", he was a manlet.
Yeah, he was a very little guy.
That's so funny because when you think of him on the TV, you don't think of that. You think?
Oh well, he
but
would have
that's
never
the trick,
been.
right?
He would have never been filmed in a way you could tell he was
Always
short.
like a mid body shot, and no perspective.
Right.
He's not going to get mogged by a Winklevoss or anything like that on camera. Hey, good for him. I respect that. I mean,
hey, he was. He was. Yeah, you got
to work with what God gave you.
Yeah, and he was very concerned with his image in all ways, and we're going to see some of that. But like starting with how short he was. I mean, he's 5'4" 118 pounds when he graduates high school. So
of course he had to be charismatic. It was that or get stuffed into a locker.
exactly. And everybody liked him. People's parents liked him. You can't find anything bad about him as a kid, right?
You're gonna make it in show business, kid.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm. Now, being born in 1924, when you're 18, it is 1942, and 1942, as an American young man, you pretty much went to World War II.
Yeah.
So he goes to World War II. Now, there's some debate about whether he signed up or was drafted, but whatever the case, he wanted to go. And he actually, when he showed up in Fort Niagara, he decided he wanted to be a paratrooper because paratroopers had status. Mm-hmm. And he had already learned from high school and, telling jokes and telling stories and, becoming popular and those kinds of things that he thrived on attention. Right. And so first day he sees some paratroopers walking. He's like, I need to be those guys. Those guys are dressed sharp. Everybody respects them. Right. They're this elite thing. I got to be one of those guys.
Well, you have to have balls of steel to be a paratrooper. And in World War II, it's like, we're going to fly you over enemy lines. Yes. You're going to drop in and you're going to do these particular things. And there are some stories out of the world wars of things that paratroopers accomplished that are just incredible.
Oh, yeah.
These guerrilla missions in the back. Yeah. Wild. Totally wild.
He wanted to sign up for this, and at first they told him he was too short. So he came back, and they didn't let him do it. He came back, and once again, he talked this colonel, because the Serling boys get what the Serling boys want. He talked, and hey, I respect that. Like, you just walk into a room and like, this is what I want, and I'm not leaving until I get it. Essentially,
right.
I'm kind of like, oh man, I got to do that a little more, or learn how to.
You gotta be assertive.
Yeah. So he does become a paratrooper, or he's allowed to try. Right, he's got to do basic training, and there's some other specialized training and stuff. Mm-hmm. But he does fine. He's despite how small he is, he's strong and he's fit, and he can handle himself a little bit. And in the time where they're basically being waited to deploy, he actually starts boxing competitively. He wins 17 out of 18 fights, and the only thing he loses is the regional catchweight fight. He's fighting other little guys.
Right. This isn't Mike Tyson.
They're same size.
Sure.
17. You beat up 17 guys your size, one after another, who know how to fight a little bit. That's pretty good.
I didn't know that he was a boxer. Interesting. Yeah. So, and this, of course, is a time when boxing was a major sport. Oh yeah. Not this clown show that we have now.
Yeah. No. It was like baseball and boxing. I don't know what else.
Big time.
I don't know what other sport people would have been paying attention to. Football, college football,
I mean, the big sports at the time were definitely going to be baseball, and boxing was huge. And of course, there's a lot of serious boxing going on. I'm not talking smack, but I mean, the fact of the matter is, America really only gets interested in boxing when we have world champion heavyweights,
right?
And we haven't had that in a long time. I totally respect that. It's got to be one of the most difficult sports in the world. UFC, the whole thing.
Oh yeah.
But we've got this Jake Paul fighting Mayweather. Can't even. My brain is just melting out of my ears at this. I mean, it's like YouTube versus the greatest pound for pound boxer of all time.
The thing, Jake Paul can't handle Floyd Mayweather, but Jake Paul can handle himself.
Is it? I think it's Logan Paul is fighting,
Logan
maybe.
Paul. Right? Yeah, I haven't followed that close, but I watched a little bit of Logan Paul. That dude can handle himself.
Yeah,
if you go to the bar, that guy can beat up probably everybody in the bar.
Well, and they are going to make a lot of dough. They are going to make a lot of Dogecoin.
I'm not. That's right. I'm not going to watch it, but hey, man, get it. Yep, you got to get what you can. So disappointingly, Serling ends up going to the Pacific Theater. He's a Jewish guy, and he'd been hearing about the Holocaust. His father had been very early on the dangers of Hitler.
He wanted to go kill some Nazis.
He did, man, and good for him, right? Because who deserved it more than them, right? At that time. So he ships off to New Guinea initially, and he becomes very popular among the regiment. He's the jokester. He's always known for dirty jokes, pranks, chatting, telling stories. Everybody, anything you read about him where someone knew him personally will say something along these lines of like, oh, we just love to listen to him tell stories. Oh, he always had a joke you'd never heard, something like that, right? So he becomes very popular, and at one point in this waiting for action, this is when he decides what he's going to do. He says, there are a million words on the radio. We're listening to the radio all the time. Somebody's got to be writing these, and I don't see why I can't make money doing this, right? So he kind of decides this, but he's in the middle of Pacific Theater. It's not going to happen.
How is he not at this point overcome with self-doubt?
Right.
How is he not crushed by the blank page, Brad?
He's gotten everything he's ever wanted for his entire life.
Okay.
Mostly through force of will.
Love it. Great.
Right. Okay. So now everything's, it's kind of fun so far. They haven't seen any action or whatever, but eventually they get deployed to the Philippines. And specifically they get deployed to an island called, I believe it's called Leyte in the Philippines. Leyte. Leyte. Okay.
Yeah. Lady, that's what I've heard. I don't know, but yeah.
So this is what had happened here fundamentally, and I'm sure I'm missing things.
This was a big battle.
It was a big battle, and it lasted for a long time. So there was a fierce naval engagement, and what ended up happening was many Japanese soldiers ended up on this island, and they sent the Allied forces basically went in and we're going to wipe them out or imprison them or get them to leave this island, right? This is going to be a standoff. Serling, despite being a paratrooper, gets steps off the boat with all of his regiment and other regiments onto this island, and they don't leave for months. At first, it's kind of just waiting around, but then they begin to slowly march across the island with the idea of flushing out Japanese soldiers. And once it gets going, it is firefights every night. It is hiding in foxholes, listening for sounds, standing up, and just firing into the darkness. It's every night. You saw
action big time.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
Yes. And every night you woke up and there were bodies, and you just hoped there were more Japanese bodies than Allied bodies. And
is this is like jungle fighting?
Oh yeah, this is like, we don't see jungle fighting like this again until Vietnam. Basically. Yeah. And so, and here was another thing that happened as well. So they were supposed to get airdropped supplies as they were marching across this island. The airstrip that was supposed to resupply them was attacked by the Japanese, and that supply line got cut. And so they were literally, Serling and his regiment were literally fighting all night, drinking rainwater and eating edible roots all day.
Yow.
By the time he got through to the end of it, and it was basically considered a success, but I don't know that Serling considered it all a success.
Sure.
He had lost 18 pounds. Now he only weighed 118 pounds. So he walks out of the woods, a different man, 100 pounds, 5'4", 19 years old, had been fighting gunfights for weeks at a time. And he never really, there's a degree to which you never come back from that. Now, he doesn't just go home. He then gets sent deeper into the Philippines, a city called Luzon. And I learned a little bit about the Pacific Theater that I didn't know about. Eventually, he was going to get sent to Manila. And Manila was some of the fiercest fighting and most torturous killing outside of Warsaw and all of World War II. So
there was some grotesque stuff that happened in the Pacific Theater. The Japanese did some terrible things. Obviously, it was not a good time.
There was the Japanese apparently killed 100,000 Filipinos in the city of Manila, which I don't know how many people lived there at the time, but it was pretty crazy. Obviously, 100,000 people in any city is a lot. So there was this one bit. This is how intense the Pacific Theater was, and Serling was on the doorstep of this. Word had come back from the 1st Cavalry and paratroop units in Manila that the devastation in terms of human life surpassed anything they imagined. The retreating Japanese, angry at apparently losing the war, because this is towards the end, vented their frustrations on the Filipino people, committing incredible acts of violence without provocation. Inside the walled cities, for instance, the Japanese herded several hundred Filipinos into a room measuring 10 feet by 10 feet by 20 feet, then sealed the door shut. Days later, when the suffocated and crushed human bodies began to decay, the gases from the corpses caused an explosion, blowing the door off its hinges. Other reports mention that nuns and priests had been crucified on the crucifixes in their churches, and that Filipino women had had Japanese bayonets plunged into them and ripped up toward their necks. So this was the darkness that Serling was on the doorstep of, right? Now, not much later, I think he was in for 2 years. He supposedly got some injuries. It's kind of ambiguous. He did get a Purple Heart. He claimed to have shrapnel, but biographers haven't been able to find that. It was very ambiguous. Not sure what happened, but in a way, who cares, right?
I'm just still reeling from the idea of you've got this 118-pound boxer from Binghamton, New York, which is like a Rockwell painting thrust into this horror.
Right. Yeah. And so this lasted with him for the rest of his life. So I'm going to do the thing I did about small towns. I'm going to give you a Twilight Zone premise, an episode that he wrote. It's one called A Quality of Mercy. A young gung-ho American in World War II, Second Lieutenant Cattell, orders his war-weary soldiers to make a near-suicidal attack on a group of sick and wounded Japanese soldiers holed up in a cave. Sergeant Casarano, who knows the men have had enough of war, tries to talk them out of it. The attack will accomplish nothing but pointless deaths on both sides. But Cattell pulls rank and stands firm on his orders, intent on proving himself. Suddenly, Lieutenant Cattell finds himself in Corregidor 3 years earlier in the war and gets a new perspective. He has become Lieutenant Yamuri in the Japanese army and is ordered to attack a group of American soldiers in the cave. In vain, he tries to dissuade the captain from the attack, but the Japanese captain believes the young man is sick with jungle fever, or worse, has lost his nerve. He tells him to straighten up or stay with the wounded. His mind reeling from what he has just experienced, Cattell finds himself back in 1945 as the American soldier, with his men telling him that they've gotten word the atomic bomb has been dropped. They've been ordered not to attack the cave and fall back. The young man seems relieved in light of his revelation. Right, so Serling, despite having fought in this war and despite, being eye to what is it from Big Lebowski, being eye to eye in the jungle or something like that.
Man in the black pajamas.
That's a worthy adversary.
Yeah.
Serling, his number one. We'll get into his politics a little bit, but his biggest thing, he thought the root of all evil was could be drawn down to bigotry, was people hating each other because of what group that they belonged to. And this is despite all of this, it'd be very easy for a young man without a lot of other experiences to come back and have real issues with Japanese people, right? I think, not that they'd be right, but you can understand the psychology of that.
Sure, without a doubt. I mean, and then beyond all of that, there was so much dehumanizing propaganda on all sides that you can't really, I mean, obviously you want to, anyway, we understand what was going on.
You understand how you get to that point. Serling never apparently got that. Serling always, and maybe he learned it here or maybe he learned it before in Binghamton, he didn't have he didn't truck for any kind of bigotry whatsoever, and he thought it was really the problem. And in fact, despite the fact that them bombing Nagasaki and Hiroshima essentially allowed him to go home, he thought it was a terrible idea. He hated Douglas MacArthur. He said, "I will hate that SOB until the day that I die." He didn't like how the war was carried out. There was some issues there. Though he, by all accounts, did what he was supposed to do. He was involved in urban warfare. He definitely, he wasn't somebody who was shooting up in the air and pretending to shoot. He was in combat, in interviews even. Reading this book, I read this book by, it's really the only good biography, not the only good, there's two. Joel Engel wrote this book called Rod Serling. Rod Serling definitely got a couple casualties while he was over there, and who knows how many.
He sounds like the guy you want on your dodgeball team.
A little bit, yeah.
He sounds like a good guy to have in your corner.
I think he was an intense guy, and he tried to do the right thing too. This is the thing you kind of see through his life and his work and that sort of thing. I think he would have been a good guy to have in your crew. But there's also some absurdity I wanted to mention, just because last thing on the war in Leyte, however we're saying that.
Leyte Gulf, that's what I heard.
Leyte. So once they got their supply lines cut off, and they finally got supplies after a while, and this guy Melvin Levy, who was Rod Serling's kind of best friend in the regiment, they see the boxes coming down from the plane, but it's kind of foggy and kind of rainy, and they can't quite see it, and Melvin Levy literally gets a supply box dropped on his head. And there's no more Melvin Levy.
Melvin. Oh, what a way to go.
Right? You've been waiting for a couple of weeks. You're starving. You literally just ate some roots, and this
you get killed by rations. What a way to go.
There's some deep irony and absurdity.
Pour one out for Melvin.
Yeah, for real. So, okay, so Serling comes back to the United States. He enrolls in Antioch College. I want to read something, because veterans, particularly veterans who've seen some deep action, they often don't talk about it. And we're not going to talk about it much more after this one little bit, but he did struggle with what we would now call PTSD, most likely. And so not long after he got back, his brother Bob, who was also a writer of some pretty notable success, took him out to dinner. So one occasion, Bob took, this is from the Joel Engel biography. On one occasion, this is shortly after the war, Bob took Rod and his date to the Wagon Wheel restaurant in Springfield, 9 miles north of Yellow Springs, where Antioch College is, and where Dave Chappelle lives, apparently. That was the night I realized how deeply his war experience had been etched in his brain, Bob says. He got bombed on Southern Comfort and started to fight the Battle of Leyte all over again. Serling was hallucinating and screaming. They're coming through the doors. The Japs are coming. Nothing that Bob or Serling's date or the restaurant manager did calmed him down. He was actually repulsed by them and evaded their advances, fearing they were Japanese firing at him. When they finally took him out of the restaurant, Bob drove him back to the dorm, removed his clothes, shoved him into a cold shower, and put him in bed. When Serling awakened the next day, he remembered nothing of the incident. Bob is convinced that his brother suffered the rest of his life from nightmares and resultant insomnia brought on by the war.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Was booze his medication of choice, or did he move on to something else?
Yeah, he kind of, there's not a whole lot of evidence that he sort of fell down the alcohol. There's tiers to alcoholism, and it's not clear that he went much further than the first few steps, But yeah, certainly that was something that was part of his life, and kind of came up a little bit
so
more
he got
later.
Blackout drunk, and he is back in the war.
Yes.
Yeah. Whoa, doggy.
Right. His penchant was cigarettes. He smoked 4 packs a day. It's very difficult. You can find some interviews with him that are televised where he's not smoking. It is very difficult to find footage of him, particularly from the 60s, where he is not smoking a cigarette. But yeah, so that was his thing. He sucked those things back pretty good. And we're going to talk about an odd effect that actually had in him that I'd never even heard of before. So anyway, he goes to Antioch College, apparently, pretty good college. He interned at a bunch of radio stations. Sometimes he earned these jobs because his writing was pretty good, because he'd now sort of dedicated himself, at least somewhat, to this I'm going to write for radio thing. Other people gave him jobs just because he had a really good voice. He had a great voice for radio. So why not? He would work for radio stations in Ohio. He also worked for a radio station in New York City. But there's this transition happening because in television has sort of been not invented, but you're starting to get people have televisions in their home. 1949, the first sitcom comes on. Not long later, you've got, Desilu Productions and all of that. So it's early days of TV.
The laugh tracks. Everything's
well, this is the thing. Nobody knew what they were doing, which was great for Serling.
Why don't we just pepper some laughs in, Johnny? Right. Just like the man opens the door. Right. There's this weird weird schizoid quality about
oh yeah, definitely.
Every time I watch an old sitcom, I just go, what on earth? You know, the man shaking his fist at his wife. It's so funny. It is. It's a Twilight Zone all its own.
Oh no, that's what's kind of weird. They all kind of. I feel like we watch a fair amount of I Love Lucy in our house. Yeah, and they always feel like vaguely like Twilight Zone episodes to me. Like
I love some classic television. I just
yeah. Well, they're definitely. I mean, some of the writing is snappy and it's not bad. It's just
Mary Tyler Moore holds up. I mean, that's good stuff. Yeah. I mean, it's like watching a Minneapolis that no longer exists, so that's cool. We love it. We need a Mary Tyler Moore reboot where she's wearing Kevlar the entire time.
Right.
You're not gonna make it on your own, Mary.
Oh, Mary Tyler.
Mary needs to join a gang. Anyway, classic TV. And this, that must have felt too like a golden age on its own. I mean, television really settled into a trashy kind of middle as it came of age, but there were always bright spots. And I'm sure right away, I mean, gee whiz, you're going from radio, now you're going to the bright new thing, television. It's going to be big.
They were definitely still figuring it out. It was like there was Hollywood had been going on for a long time. Unless you were a washout from Hollywood, you weren't going to go over and work for TV, really. The radio, a lot of the radios were old dogs and they weren't going to change either. And it wasn't clear that TV was more prestigious than radio at that time either, right? I mean, now you would think certainly working in TV is better than working in radio, just opportunity-wise, but that wasn't necessarily clear then. So a lot of the stuff had the quality of like student productions, which, like I said, was perfect for Serling because Serling he had to talk his way into this, basically, right? So why not? I mean,
this is that classic greatest generation boomer, to a degree, boomer generation Wikipedia problem we have, where you look at their Wikipedias and you just go, wait, what? How did he go from, now he's a Fulbright fellow, but he never went to college? Like what? Or he flunked out of college, but now he's got a job and he's directing Spartacus? Like what? He got D's in high school, but then he got this job. It was literally this different world where you could just show up and be confident and have a haircut.
As long as I had a haircut and some old man liked your spunk, or whatever. That was all.
You got a lot of spunk, kid. You're gonna make it. Yeah. Right. So now today it's like where do you even begin?
Right.
You got to intern for no money for 3 years to even have a shot.
Right.
Yeah.
So he manages to. He works his way up, but it happens quickly. So he goes to work for this this TV station in Cincinnati, WLW. This is after college.
If I may, the other thing, I'm not trying to step on you here, Brad, because I know you're telling the story, but there's part of the difference too is like you're coming back from having seen the dirt, seen hell on earth.
Yeah.
A radio station manager in Cincinnati, one is going to respect that. And two is not going to intimidate you at all.
That's a good point.
Nothing compares to Leahy and what you saw.
Yeah, it's like, this is just a guy. Yeah, I can talk to him.
Is anybody shooting at me? No.
Right.
All right, I can do it.
Right. So, that's a very good point. And he had and Serling had a lot of confidence. I mean, that was part of his charisma, was that, he could hold court with anybody, basically. And this is the thing, and I'm overstepping this. He was a very smart guy, too. Like, obviously, the stuff that he wrote wasn't Shakespeare exactly, but the sheer volume of it,
bulk of the series, dude.
Yeah, the bulk of the series in and of itself says something about the fertility of his brain, right? So anyway, that started to become clear to people. He writes a bunch of scripts for this show, this station in Cincinnati. They don't really go anywhere because it's only broadcast in Cincinnati. He's literally writing like soap commercials and like dramas and all of this stuff. So he's doing that. It's a crazy amount of work, but he's also trying to get freelance and he's sending out scripts to other broadcasters. And one of the ways that TV worked back then that was much different than it works now is you had a lot of craft theater and the Lux Theater. And they were these shows that were anthology series that were sponsored almost entirely by one company. And every episode was like a different thing. They weren't continuous. They were just like, every Thursday, the Craft Theater presents you a 1-hour drama about right? And so this is Yeah, this is the milieu that Serling manages to get himself in.
Jimmy works in a soup kitchen,
right?
And he meets Janie, and she works in the front.
Yeah, I think I actually read about that one.
Jimmy is just back from the war,
right.
And he has a new kind of soup. But Janie is skeptical.
Right.
Riveting. You gotta go into that. You gotta go into that David Lynch voice. Damn good pie.
That's exactly what it was like.
Janie has a polka dot dress this week.
God, I'm kind of wishing I watched some of the old Serling stuff, but I'm kind of wishing now that I had watched some of the other ones just to see what they were like, because I imagine they were very much like that.
Old man Johnson has had a few again. He stumbles in. The laugh track.
So he writes. So Serling isn't writing anything like science fiction now. He's writing dramas. They're all like these very taut. The plots are very tight. As they would be in an hour television show. You can't, he's not trying to write like Samuel Beckett or anything. They're 1 hour dramas or half hour dramas, and they work
Here's
out
the
really
commercial
well
break,
and
this is the place where we sell the soap, and then we come back, and
he's just
the
writing
formula.
He's writing these. They're slowly getting the attention of producers and things like this. He eventually gets something on the Hallmark Hall of Fame, which was a little bit more prestige. So one thing I wanted to say this before I get into these other things. So he's writing these shows. He saw himself, or he was setting himself up. He wanted to be the new Arthur Miller, essentially, which is a laudable aim, I would say. It's in Death of a Salesman and the other Arthur Miller work.
You get to marry Marilyn Monroe.
That's right.
They were married, right?
They were. Yeah. So, why not? That's a lofty goal. And he also saw that people like Patty Chayefsky and even Gore Vidal had done good, what he considered mature, intelligent, thoughtful work inside of television. So, Rod Serling thought, well, why the heck can't I do this, right? And so eventually he does. He writes a script called Patterns.
May I stop you? He's in Cincinnati now at the time.
Oh, sorry. I'm kind of skipping some stuff.
That's all right.
Yeah, from Cincinnati, he eventually he gets an agent, and his agent convinces him to move to New York City. He decides that he can't move all the way to New York City, so he's going to move to Connecticut. So for a long time, he's in Connecticut, and he will commute if he needs to get into New York. He never really lives in New York City properly. Eventually, he'll be out on the West Coast, though, for a lot. Eventually, he becomes bicoastal, actually. So he writes a show called Patterns. And it becomes, before it even gets produced, it becomes sort of legendary in the industry. Like everybody who read it loved it, thought it was amazing. They actually made it 3 different times in the span of a couple of years. Once was live, because they were still in the live era. Once was a filmed version, but for television. And once they tried to actually turn it into a movie you'd go see at the theater. I saw, I think, the second version, and it's actually really good, I will say. So I'll give you a little taste of what it's about, because it's thematically perfect Rod Serling, except it's not science fiction. So most of the scenes of Pattern, and this is just from the Wikipedia page, but most of the scenes from Patterns are set in the corporate boardroom and surrounding offices of Ramsey and Company, a Manhattan industrial empire headed by the ruthless Walter Ramsey. He brings youthful industrial engineer Fred Staples in to do a top executive job at the head office. Ramsey is grooming Staples to replace the aging Bill Briggs as second in command. Briggs has been with the firm for decades, having worked for and admired the company's the company's founder, Ramsey's father. His concern for the employees clashes repeatedly with Ramsey's ruthless methods, blah, 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 blah. Basically, the owner of the head of this company pushes Briggs so hard that Briggs has a heart attack in the hallway and dies. The Staples guy basically says, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to work for you. You're obviously a prick. Like, this isn't going to work out. And Ramsey says, like, well, you can do that, or you can just run away from every conflict you want, or you can stay here and be tested and be challenged and make accomplishments. And Staples works out this deal with him. He's like, listen, I will work for you, but I am never going to be your yes man. I will push back on you on everything, and I will do everything I can to get you out of this company and take over. And Ramsey, the head of the company, says, that's fine with me. Let's do it. And it's this cool kind of ending where they both butt heads ultimately, and you realize they're going to be locked in this thing. It's snappy, it's smart, it moves really quickly, it's really coolly paced, it looks good. It was, in fact, at this time, and who knows how Serling did this, he probably talked his way into it, it was possibly the most expensive television production up to that point. He was not particularly well known at this point. He'd had a show called Requiem for a Dream that had been critically acclaimed, but beyond that, nobody really cared yet. But
Patterns, and this was done in the context of the Hallmark thing?
I think it was it on Hallmark? Yes, I believe it was on Hallmark originally. Yeah, it was a 1-hour drama that came out on TV. I believe it was in the Hallmark Hall of Fame, if I'm not mistaken. Or no, sorry, this was Kraft Theater. So
Kraft Mac and Cheese presents Rod Serling's Patterns.
Right. And it turned out
just
to be
hear
this,
it now.
Intense corporate drama.
Right. Selling you noodles and cheese in the middle of it. Right. Yeah, the Kraft family. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and it was weird. The corporate involvement was, and we're going to talk about this is my next topic, actually. But the important thing about the Pattern story is this made him basically the phone started ringing as soon as Patterns came off the air, and it never really stopped for Rod Serling until maybe 10 or 15 years later.
Can I interject and say this? I looked it up, and the poster for it is amazing. There's a boardroom, and there's a man in the crosshairs, and it says portrait of a man on a battlefield.
Right.
Ruthless men and ambitious women clawing for control of $1 billion empire.
Right.
Patterns of power.
Right.
Yeah, very cool. It's like a television play is what they call it, right?
Yeah.
1956.
And I watched it. Like I said, I think I watched the second one for TV, I think is what it was. And honestly, it's as good. It's pretty good it's not quite Citizen Kane, but it's watchable.
Is there a quality of Hitchcock to it?
There is a little bit, yeah. There's definitely a Hitchcock influence. Now, Serling didn't direct it, and he wouldn't have been able to. So who knows what decisions were getting made there? But I think it stands up as a reasonably good, 50s film. But this sponsorship thing you're talking about is really interesting because after Patterns, he basically the money starts stacking up, and he's a workaholic. So he will just write all day long until he passes out, basically. And so TV needs a guy like this. Not only a big name, but somebody who will produce something all of the time, right? So he rises, after Patterns, he rises to prominence pretty quickly. And he starts butting up against these sponsorships. The sponsors are kind of ridiculous, honestly. And he becomes known as the angry young man of television. And then you got to remember, he thinks that racism and bigotry are the worst thing in the world. And something I didn't mention, he thinks that television in particular is something that is supposed to edify and provide commentary, right? Because it's broadcast. So it's supposed to provide a dialogue on social issues, right? So he wants all of his shows to do something with that, and the sponsors aren't really having it. The sponsors are like literally the sponsors.
We're just trying to sell mac and cheese here.
Exactly.
Well, I don't know what this has to do with Middle America, kid.
Right. He had a show, and he had a movie. A television thing where he was trying to basically retell the Emmett Till story. I'm sure are you familiar with the Emmett Till story? That kid. He was a kid, I think, in Mississippi or Alabama. A young black kid, and he had flirted with a white girl, or maybe people thought he had kissed her or something, and he was beaten to death by the townsfolk.
I've heard of that.
Yeah. It's a terrible story, and Rod Serling tried to make a fictionalized version of that, and so I'm like, yeah, the script's really good, but can we make Emmett Till middle-aged, and can he be vaguely Hispanic, and actually, can it be in New England, and
Right.
And like by the time you're done,
Just
you're like
gutting everything.
right.
Yeah.
By the time you're done, like we're not even talking about the same thing anymore.
Sure.
It's like an isolated incident with no greater. So stuff like this was happening all the time. He tells a story when he was making the Twilight Zone about there was an episode that was set on the bridge of a British battleship, and the seamen called down for tea. And one of the sponsors was the makers of instant coffee, and they said, "Well, we can't have them ordering tea. You gotta do something about that. You gotta make a change. We can't have our characters drinking tea. Are you kidding me?"
Right.
And he changed it, like because you can't. They could just pull funding, and you didn't have like 12 commercial people providing commercials. You had 1, 2, maybe 3 if you were lucky sponsors for the whole season. And if they pulled out, you're done. You don't have a budget anymore.
It's all craft all the time. Right. Everything is, you're going to eat so much mac and cheese. You're going to have mac and cheese coming out of your ears by the time you're done.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's not poison for your children.
Right.
There's no asbestos in our mac and cheese any longer.
Not anymore. Now with 90% less asbestos. Yeah. Just smoking cigarettes. There's a lot of Rod Serling. He did a lot of cigarette commercials later, too. He's like, the Oasis, the softest, gentlest, smoke that you can possibly imagine.
Right. 9 out of 10 doctors recommend Oasis cigarettes. Right. Trust the science.
Right. So this goes on for a while. He makes a bunch of shows, and he's winning Emmys. Like between Patterns.
Oh, he's just killing it.
He's killing it.
And is he still living in Connecticut at this point?
He eventually just moves to LA.
And
he's agent hopping. He's making more and more and more.
Is he single here?
No. I'm sorry.
Okay.
He's married. Yeah. He married. I kind of skipped over this.
Yeah.
He met a woman in Antioch, Carolyn, and they got married. He has 2 children in his 20s somewhere.
That explains the I'm living in Connecticut, I'm not living in Manhattan.
No, I'm not going to live in the city.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
sure.
So after he moves to LA, they start sort of splitting time between Connecticut. He's mostly in LA. The family doesn't really come with him when he's doing that. And then they also have a place in Cayuga Lake, New York. Because he's starting.
So he's crushing it. He's starting
to stack dollars.
Yeah.
And he's getting there's a while he would get several $1,000s for a 1-hour script that he could write in a week or two.
This goes back to again our boomer greatest generation problem. It's like, well, I wrote for a feature for Time magazine, and I moved to Peru and lived off those proceeds for 3 years. Well, I finished my novel. I sold that, and then moved to Europe for 10 years. Where I married the heiress of a a horse fortune, and now now I'm living in Toronto. Like, what?
Now if you do it doesn't make any sense. You never actually did anything. Like,
he wrote one feature for Time and one novel that was well received.
Right.
And the movie rights were bought. You never have to work again. Congratulations.
Right. Yeah, that for us, for our generation, that pays off your student loans, maybe.
Right, barely.
Yeah. So he is starting to stack that cheese, and he not necessarily, I don't know how good he was at negotiating for himself, but he was really good at talking agents into representing him and convincing them to get him good deals, right? So he started making a lot of money. Before the Twilight Zone aired, and we're going to get to the Twilight Zone in the meat of the Twilight Zone here in a second. Before the Twilight Zone aired, he was the most famous television writer in the country. This is before the Twilight Zone ever came out. So we kind of have to put that into that context, because most people now who Rod Serling rings a bell, all they know about him is the Twilight Zone. They don't even really realize that he wrote these stories. Now, here's the thing, though. We got to get into a little bit more of what the darkness is, because we're Art of Darkness. So we talked about the PTSD and, the rapacious smoking. There's a thing about Serling being a workaholic, being a starved for attention, being super confident, and not being a perfectionist. So if he'd have been a little bit more of a perfectionist and maybe not so much some of these other things, he may have really become the Arthur Miller of his generation or whatever. Or Arthur Miller number 2. I feel like he's probably the same generation almost. Anyway, he could have become that guy. Serling seemed to be much more interested in quantity than quality. He was cranking them out because he could get a lot of money for them. He wanted first to take care of his family, but then he wanted to have a nice car, and then he wanted to have a nice house, and then he wanted to have nice clothes.
A little bit of the Fitzgerald problem.
Yeah.
Where you start writing for magazines, now you're writing for television, your colleagues maybe don't think you're as serious.
Right.
And it's sort of artistic death.
Yes. And he definitely experienced that. I'm going to give you a little bit of a reading from something he said a little bit later in his career about this whole fame thing, money thing. This is Serling himself. They give you $1,000 a week, and they keep on giving you $1,000 a week. And by the way, that's like 10 grand now, until that's what you need to live on. And then every day you live after that, you're afraid they'll take it away from you. It's all very scientific. It's based on the psychological fact that a man is a grubbing, hungry little sleaze. In 24 hours, you can develop a taste for caviar. In 48 hours, fish eggs are no longer a luxury. They're a necessity. Right? So he understands he got ratcheted down into this thing, and he eventually sort of gives up caring about it. But early in his career, pre-Twilight Zone, he's the angry young man of television. He's like, we need to be making social commentary. We need to be dealing with the issues, and there's bigotry in this country, and and good, fair enough, right? I'm fine with all of that. But eventually it gets dashed against the rocks and then kind of
swallowed by
away.
the grabbling. I gotta make more money. I gotta pay for the house in Connecticut. Oh, I gotta pay for the lake house, and I got a place in L.A. And did he mess around while he was in L.A. too? Did he have?
Well, yes, because he needed attention, right? He literally there's like mention of attention for him was like a drug. He needed it desperately. And as he got older, he was able to kind of deal with not having it so much. But like, you'll read these things, it was like, he'll have a year where he got an Emmy. If later in that year he gets a rejection for something, he's a failure. Right? It's like literally you won the award for the best show on TV. And then
a little bit of a Napoleon complex going on here, I think. Right. I'm king of the world. Right. I'm the great Rod Serling.
Right. There is definitely a bit of that. So, but it seemed almost more not so much ego as self. Maybe I don't know if it's self-loathing even. I mean, I'm not inside of his head. It wasn't that he thought he was better than everybody necessarily. It was just he wanted to be the best. I think he was willing to admit when he wasn't, but it was still a little hard on him. So anyway, writing TV. He'd sort of had this idea for the Twilight Zone back in like the mid 50s. And what started to really push him over into trying to talk somebody into getting it produced, which he eventually would do, was he realized that he could circumvent all of this censorship if he dealt with all of the issues he wanted to deal with in the context of a science fiction or fantasy show. Much like Star Trek did, right? It was like, you make, he tells a story about when he was first working in TV, you were not allowed to say somebody was a Democrat or a Republican. Like, so you couldn't, like the amount of how washed out you were from being able to say anything about what was happening was, everything had to be, literally married couples had to sleep in separate beds on TV, right? There was this like, we're not actually going to confront anything whatsoever.
Right.
Which is, no matter what side of the issues you come down on, is not necessarily
pretty neutered.
Right.
And not a very good atmosphere for the creation of impactful art.
Right. Yeah. You're going to have to ruffle some feathers, and you can't have them saying, well, is there a Coca-Cola can in the background? Because that suggests this is in the South. And then if it's, literally that level of detail. Right. So he eventually, he starts kind of talking his way into getting this Twilight Zone show made. One thing I want to note around this time, 57, 50, let's say we're in 57, 58, because we're coming right into the Twilight Zone. He starts to experience intense tingling numbness in his right pinky finger. Now, I got to go back a little bit. When he was in World War II, his father died before Rod was able to get home. His father died at the age of 50 or 51 from a heart attack. And so this is the Serling family curse, is a weak heart. in some way. 57 or 58. Rod Serling is 33. Is that right? Yeah. Starts feeling a tingling numbness in his right pinky finger. Doctor tells him to not stop smoking so freaking much, right? This will come back around, though. So anyway, one way he gets into, before Twilight Zone, he writes his first science fiction piece, which is called The Time Element, which played in the Desilu Playhouse, which was basically the Desi Arnaz, Lucille Ball, their version of craft theater. And interestingly, in The Time Element, written by Rod Serling, one of the key plot points is that a character travels back in time and makes a fortune by betting on sporting events.
Aha, good one. Right.
Yeah.
I am telling myself 10 years ago, buy Bitcoin, dummy. Buy Bitcoin, dummy. Buy Bitcoin.
And don't sell until 60.
Hodl.
At least.
Hodl Bitcoin.
Until at least
buy
60.
and hodl Bitcoin, Kevin. Hodl. What the hell are you talking? Hodl. Hodl Bitcoin, Kevin. Buy
It'll make
stacks
sense.
sats, Kevin, and hodl. Kevin back there is like, what are you talking? I'm in grad school. What are you talking about?
What do you mean? What do you mean?
Just buy $10 for it.
How could $10 matter?
Just trust me. I'm being dragged back into the present where everything sucks. So no.
Yeah, see, that's a good Twilight. That would be like a good modern Twilight Zone episode.
I think we might have to flesh it out a little more.
A little bit. No, Rod would. Rod would just run with it. He would just smoke 19 cigarettes and he would just finish it.
The episode's called Hodl.
Right. But it's written like slightly in hieroglyphics. Like, what?
Yeah, right. Hodl.
It's like some weird ancient wisdom. Okay, so I want to give you an idea of how Rod Serling pitched, how he pitched Twilight Zone. So one day he meets with William Dozer, who is the CBS's chief of West Coast programming, to pitch this idea for the Twilight Zone. Dozer had been introduced to Serling before, and the executive liked the writer immediately, which almost everybody did, finding him amiable and charming. He remembers also being struck by Serling's too obvious elevator shoes. Rod was very conscious of his shortness, Dozier points out. He would stand at his full height all the time. In his usual style, Serling paced the room, using furniture and drapery for props, as he animatedly and enthusiastically tried to sell his series idea. Executives who didn't know Serling could have been an excuse for forgetting that this was a writer, not an auditioning actor. But that had become his style. He entertained. The stories, Serling said, would be science fiction, but not really science fiction. Fantasy, but not really fantasy. It was going to be imaginative fiction for TV. So this is kind of where this is Twilight Zone's episodes are all over the place. Some of them are in space. Some of them are like vaguely not even science fiction. They're like one little weird thing happens, right? They're sort of all over the map. Let me just run you through a couple. Like, I'm going to tell you like my four, not even my favorite, four that are, I think, encapsulate what the Twilight Zone's all about. First is Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, which is one of the more famous, one of the first. Monsters Are Due on Maple Street is basically there's some radio report that there's been an alien invasion, and that the aliens are posing as human beings. This neighborhood, Maple Street, all of the lights go out, the neighbors come out in the street, and they start suspecting each other immediately, right? And they sort of all turn on each other. It turns out that there wasn't even an alien invasion, right? So not even science fiction, really.
Sort of psychological, and again getting into the psyche of the paranoia of that time.
Oh yeah,
the latter half of the 20th century for America is in no small part defined by paranoia.
Right.
Somebody might be getting a better deal.
Absolutely.
The Russians might be next door.
Absolutely, and that's what a lot of these space ones were about. And this next one I was going to tell you about, this one was called The Shelter, and how it works is one guy in the neighborhood has built himself a bomb shelter. Everybody thinks he's being ridiculous and he's being paranoid, but he's like, hey, what could it hurt? I've got this bomb shelter. Then the bombs start falling. He goes into the bomb shelter, and then all of his neighbors are at the door, pounding on the door, fighting with each other, clawing to get in, yada, yada. They eventually do break into the bomb shelter, only to find out, false alarm, the bombs are not falling, right? Meanwhile, this community of neighbors has torn itself apart. So it's two kind of
these are fun. They have the quality of theater. They do have the quality. They're sort of a central nugget, a kind of a metaphor, and then you blow out the character studies from there. And
right. And they like I watched The Shelter just recently, and again, it's not the greatest thing I've ever seen, but it's tight. The characters are good. Their characters are they're not just all the same. It's not 7 versions of this. They all have different wants and needs and personalities, and they're fairly well acted, and it's pretty good TV.
And we're talking about what, 45-minute runtime? It runs an hour with ads. Oh, half an hour. It's a half an hour. Okay.
Yeah. He didn't want to write half an hour at first. He thought that was hacky, and then on the 3rd season they tried to make him an hour, and he decided he hated it. He'd like learned the form of it. He'd perfected the half hour.
It's a big difference trying to write 30 minutes or an hour.
Right. Because you can just make a kernel work in 30 minutes, but after a while you gotta have it happen in multiple days, probably.
Right.
It's just enough difference. There's another episode he wrote called The Little People, which would later be used in the Simpsons Treehouse of Horror. Actually, a bunch of Simpsons Treehouse of Horror are actually just readapted Twilight Zone episodes.
Oh yeah, this stuff is seeped into the collective conscious just completely.
Yeah. The Little People is these two space traveler guys crash land on this planet. They got to fix this ship, but it's going to take a long time. The one guy is like a tough guy, but like a noble person. And the other guy is like a simpering egomaniac. And this simpering egomaniac somewhere on the planet has found a microscopic civilization. Like you can see like maybe a building with your naked eye, but that's it. And
there's 5'4" Rod Serling, and he's the king of them all. Is that what's happening?
It could have been. So this simpering sort of egomaniac guy, he becomes their god, and he will like stamp them out, and he demands that they build him an enormous statue, and like he becomes like. And the other guy, who doesn't want any part of this, he's like, these are like sort of like human beings. Like, you should just leave them alone. He eventually abandons this guy to the planet, and the guy wants to be there. And then they do something. The little people do something that displeases this guy who's given himself godlike powers. So he wipes them out. And then even gianter aliens show up on the planet and, of course, kill him. So it's a perfect Twilight Zone episode.
Karma.
Yeah.
You got to take care of the little people.
That's right. There's another great. I'll give you one more, and then I'm not going to hit you with these. I just think the premises are pretty good.
I think this is a great structure for the show. You're just peppering in these Twilight Zone episodes.
Yeah.
I feel like I understand his psychology a little more.
Sure.
So, yeah.
There's another one he wrote called "It's a Good Life," and "It's a Good Life" is about a little town. He introduces it so well. I'm going to actually just read how he introduces it. Tonight's story on the Twilight Zone is somewhat unique and calls for a different kind of introduction. This, as you may recognize, is a map of the United States, and there's a little town there called Peaksville. On a given morning not too long ago, the rest of the world disappeared and Peaksville was left all alone. Its inhabitants were never sure whether the world was destroyed and only Peaksville left untouched, or whether the village had somehow been taken away. They were, on the other hand, sure of one thing: the cause. A monster had arrived in the village. Just by using his mind, he took away the automobiles, the electricity, the machines, because they displeased him, and he moved an entire community back into the Dark Ages, just by using his mind. Now I'd like you to introduce you to some of the people in Peaksville, Ohio. This is Mr. Fremont. It's in his farmhouse that the monster resides. This is Mrs. Fremont, and this is Aunt Amy, who probably had more control over the monster in the beginning than almost anyone. But one day she forgot. She began to sing aloud. Now, the monster doesn't like singing, so his mind snapped at her, turned her into the smiling, vacant thing you're looking at now. She sings no more. And you'll note that the people in Peaksville, Ohio, have to smile. They have to think happy thoughts and say happy things, because once displeased, the monster can wish them into a cornfield or change them into a grotesque walking horror. This particular monster can read minds, you see. He knows every thought. He can feel every emotion. Oh yeah, did I forget something? Didn't I? I did forget something, didn't I? I forgot to introduce you to the monster. This is the monster. His name is Anthony Fremont. He's 6 years old, with a cute little boy face and blue, guileless eyes. But when those eyes look at you, you'd better start thinking happy thoughts, because the mind behind them is absolutely in charge. This is the Twilight Zone.
And they just zoom in on the 6-year-old, yes. And it's Ted Kaczynski. I don't like cars. I don't like that's fantastic. I got to tell you something else about this that I've been thinking about a lot lately. I went through and I watched the 2 seasons of the HBO show Rome. Which
I've always meant to watch that, but never got around to it for whatever.
Very good, very very good show, especially the first season. John Milius was one of the creators of the show, know that. Okay. And it's trashy, but the formula, but it's high trash. Yeah, it's high middlebrow trash.
And I aspire to write that.
Yeah, and fun, but the formula that HBO would then go on to use with all of its other shows was really codified in a big way by that show. It was raucous sex, and then some violence, and then some political intrigue, and then some domestic intrigue, and it's a formula, but it really works. And you've got is it Kieran Hines? Is that the name of the fellow who plays Caesar? And it's just so well acted, and it's sort of about class, and you have this high and this low. Anyway,
and you have cinema budget.
Yeah, more or less. Famously, they went so far over budget that the show got killed for it. But the reason I bring it up is that they have a conceit in there, or a structural thing they do, where they have the town crier who says, "And now Caesar, triumphant, returns from Gaul." Da, da, da. And it's exposition. And one of the things that young writers get told is, avoid exposition, blah, blah, blah. Right. What they really mean when they say avoid exposition is avoid sticking it into your characters' mouths.
Right. Yeah.
You sometimes exposition is incredible. So like in Rome, again, the crier, they just cut right to the chase. Okay, we're not going to shoot this huge battle. We're just going to tell you that Caesar won this battle. We're going to show you a little bit of the aftermath. The mind fills in the gaps, right? Yeah. This is the same thing with the Twilight Zone. Just cut right to the chase, and in 45 seconds of a monologue, completely spin the rules of this world and then drop me into it.
Right. And you needed, and this is what we worked about, having Rod Serling be the guy who did it he had a great voice. And for anybody who hasn't heard him, I almost wanted to play 10 seconds of it, because I think his voice is perfect.
I will put an intro to one of the episodes at the end of this episode. So hear Rod Serling,
and you can do any of them. He's just got this great voice, and apparently he nailed everything on one take, pretty much. But so he has this. It has this almost God, people say, well, I think Morgan Freeman is the voice of God.
Sure,
right. He had that, to me,
Don LaFontaine kind of in a world.
Yeah, he owns it completely. And, and he's standing there in his suit, and he looks very serious, and he's smoking a cigarette.
And he's also a veteran. And
and he's also in the scene, but not, the other characters don't see him, So he'll be in the living room explaining to you what's happening, but nobody in the living room sees him.
You know what it reminds me of is the narrator in Our Town.
Okay, I don't
know. Has a bit of an art. Well, Our Town is the most widely performed American play of all time, and there's a narrator who narrates it's the stage manager. It actually narrates kind of what's happening, and it's a whole thing. Yeah,
sure. Yeah. So I think he's probably borrowing. I mean, Rod didn't invent this, obviously, but it works really well, right? I want to give you one more thing. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the phenomenon. And I know, this could go, I got deep into this, so I'm trying to skip over things. And sometimes it's difficult to know what to skip because it all seems so cool. So here's a quote from, this is from the Joel Engel book again, about the inspiration for Twilight Zone. The question, quoting Joel Engel, so what attracted Rod Serling, the writer, to the world of the fantastic? Because he'd been writing all these realistic dramas. Bob Serling, his brother, said that Rod told him the Twilight Zone sprang from his frequent insomniac nights when his active imagination, fed by his lifelong love of horror films, his war experience, and the stories of such writers as Robert Heinlein, Ray Bradbury, and H.P. Lovecraft, actually, contrived fantastical plots that somehow seem plausible in the pre-dawn. Carol Serling, his wife, says that her husband wanted to believe in the unseen, but he had no direct experiences himself. So that's just, a little bit of color for this guy who basically reinvented science fiction overnight almost. So the show was almost an instant hit. It was rarely at the very tippy top of the ratings. It was a little bit too unconventional. But it was probably maybe the most enthusiastic viewing, right? So it would be, it's not, again, not selling the most advertising, but this is what people talked about around the water cooler or the soda fountain or whatever it was in 1959. Very importantly, and I think the more I think about this, the more important it becomes. It was unwittingly maybe the first show targeted at baby boomers that was not children's entertainment. Right. So they're just 1959, right? A baby boomer's like 14-ish, maybe a little younger. So by the time you get to 1965,
we're living in a weird nuclear age, man.
It's right.
Nothing's what it seems.
Right. So there's kids in college dorms smoking weed, and they're like, I just saw Twilight Zone. My mind is blown. Right. And because Serling is writing it, they frequently have this strong moral compass to the show. Somebody did the right thing and it maybe it worked out or it didn't, but somebody did the wrong thing and they got their comeuppance, right? A bunch of bandits steal 1,000 pounds of gold and then they cryogenically freeze themselves in a cave, and when they wake up, gold has no value. Right, like those.
That's what's happening right now. Bitcoin, hodl Bitcoin. Gold is worthless. Bitcoin is going to 10 trillion. It's replacing gold.
Right, exactly.
Right. Find us on Patreon. It's patreon.com/artofdarkpod.
And give us some portion of a Bitcoin.
Right.
Why not?
Chuck us some fiat. Yeah. It's worthless anyway.
Yeah, that's right. It's not worth anything to you. It's not worth anything to us. Who cares? It's just it's the gesture.
Support the show.
Yeah. Yeah. So now Twilight Zone gets picked up. It's popular. Of course, he wants to be at the top of things. He loves this. Oh, one more thing I wanted to say about this. We're talking about the cultural influences of the 1960s. I think this morality, how strongly Rod Serling was outspoken he was about civil rights and against, bigotry and that sort of thing. I'm not saying he was Martin Luther King, but I'm saying he contributed to that discourse in some small way, because you were 14 years old in 1959. You loved the Twilight Zone. Rod Serling kind of became the voice in your head to some small degree. And then 8 years later, the war in Vietnam breaks out and there's riots in Detroit, right? It's informing the perspective of people for sure. And it's, you've got Vietnam and you've got Woodstock and you've got the Beatles. And I think Rod Serling is a little bit more in there than we typically think. Certainly as many people were watching the Twilight Zone as listening to the Beatles, to be honest. So anyway, I just thought that's interesting. Now he's working. This is the thing about Twilight Zone. So he wrote an incredible amount for this show. Most of the episodes were him, right? We said bulk of the series, dude. He's writing the first season, I think it was like 34 or something, but then he's writing 20 episodes a season, right? So in a year.
And he's doing this on his own, without co-writers,
He pretty much writes these on his own. He will often have other people write whole episodes and they're credited to them, and he didn't really rewrite them. He would sometimes adapt a short story and, it would still be teleplay by Rod Serling, but frequently these were entirely his own creation. And they weren't like co-written really. He didn't have like a team of writers necessarily.
It's prodigious.
Yes. Yeah. In one 12-month period, he would write 20 Twilight Zone scripts, a book of short stories, rewrite a Broadway play. He had this play called Requiem for a Heavyweight that was very popular on TV. He kept trying to get it made as a play. It did eventually happen, but it wasn't successful. And he was also a producer for Twilight Zone at the same time. So first season, I've got it here. He wrote 28 episodes of the first season, 20 of season 2, 20 of season 3. So in 3 years, he writes 70 episodes of television.
Was there cocaine? What's the story here? Because this is
cocaine,
pretty wild.
No cocaine.
We just away from the wife and the kids in LA.
Yeah,
so maybe just workaholic grinding.
This is the thing. He was desperate to, he was a creative person. And again, like, even if I struggled with this thing about him, because I think he fell short of what he maybe could have done quality-wise in some ways. But it's clearly this is prodigious creativity. Like, very few people could come up with 80 ideas in 3 years, let alone actually flesh them out to any degree. Right. It's just a crazy product.
Yeah. And having the formula there is great, but that
Right.
is still, prolific and intense.
Yeah.
And
right.
Clearly the incentives are there. Yeah.
Yeah. And having them be successful. Right. And it's like the next year, it's like companies want to give you money to keep doing it. Like, it's a significant achievement, I think.
It's cool too, because it does have the flavor of counterculture somewhat. It's mainstream, but it's got an edge. It's quirky. It's sci-fi. It's psychological. It's got kind of all of that in there.
There's
very cool
thing. There's aliens. There's, for sure. I'm sure the cool kids were into it.
Yeah. When did it air? Was it kind of an after hours after the talk shows and
Friday at 10 p.m.
10 p.m. Right.
Yeah. So kind of
you got to stay up and watch the Twilight Zone. If you're good, if you get your homework done, Johnny.
Yeah, that's right.
You get to stay up and watch the Twilight Zone.
He apparently got letters from parents because you couldn't tape anything at the time. He apparently got letters from parents asking if they could broadcast it an hour earlier so their kids didn't have to stay up so late.
Nice. That's great. Cool.
Well, there's a lot of people wrote in, at those times.
Sure.
Something they liked or didn't like, you would write a letter.
Oh, I remember. I was a big Mystery Science Theater 3000 fan, and they'd always flash their P.O. box, Hopkins, Minnesota, St. Paul, Minnesota. People would write in. Yeah, I love that stuff. That old, TV. Good stuff.
For sure. So now, and again, we've talked about the fact that he tried to write films too. So Rod Serling did try to write movies. Very few of them were successful. He was much better at writing TV. He kind of refused to learn the TV format. He did try to write plays. As I mentioned, that Requiem for a Heavyweight, and that's why I want to kind of hit this note. They also basically didn't go anywhere. He tried to write short stories, and they were almost always terrible because he dictated them. He never really typed them. He moved way too fast. It seemed to me he moved way too fast to do anything but television. And this kind of weekly thing was perfect for him. He could crank out a new idea. He didn't, and it being an anthology, he didn't have to think about like, okay, what happened in the last episode and what happens to this person now? He could write these little capsules, which is harder in a lot of ways, but it kind of depends on how your brain works, right? This is a quote from a producer. Actually from Aaron Spelling, who's sort of famous in television later, right? And who sort of worked with Serling. Their careers overlapped a little bit. If Serling had known, Aaron Spelling once asked Serling, "How can you write so many Twilight Zone scripts?" "Easy," Serling replied. "I don't have to write the third act. The third act that's just the way it is in the Twilight Zone." So there's just this if it's weird enough, it doesn't really have to make sense at the end.
You're living in my zone, baby.
Right.
This is the Rod Serling Twilight Zone.
That's right. It's not gonna.
It doesn't have to make sense. We're making television. Right. We're selling soap here.
That's exactly. Okay, so I'm gonna kind of jump around into some quotes here, and then Twilight Zone's almost over. So I want to talk about so Twilight Zone ends. We get Rod Serling is as famous as ever. He's now you see him and you know him, right? He's literally the most famous person who you can call a writer in the world. Everybody knows who he is. Everybody knows his voice. Everybody knows his face. He's on the TV constantly. After Twilight Zone ends, he's a little bit struggling to figure out what the next project is. The show was popular, but every season sponsors were threatening to leave, and he had to cajole them or somebody else to keep paying for it. And I think he just got exhausted. He does this weird thing because he apparently likes to be in front of the camera so much that after the Twilight Zone, it actually kind of breaks my heart a little bit. After the Twilight Zone ended, he kept writing, and we'll talk about a little bit about some of his later writing projects. He just started appearing in every commercial he could get his hands on. Just soap. And I'm going to actually read. I'm going to read this one little bit. Page 301.
It's like Orson Welles.
Yes.
Doing the commercials.
Right. But
very obese.
He's already rich. He sold the Twilight Zone for like $3 million, the rights to it, or something crazy like that, right? So he's already rich. So this is again from the Joel Engel biography. In the 2 years, 1968 and 1969, so this is like 3 years after everything that happens in Serling's life. It seems like it took place over a decade, but it's like 2 years. It's really weird.
Very busy beaver.
He really was.
Yeah. By the way, if I may, I have a show title. This is going to be called Rod Serling Spunk.
Okay. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, good? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good.
In the 2 years, 1968 and 1969, Serling touted an almost unending stream of products, including Crest toothpaste, Laura Scudder potato chips, auto loans at Merchants Bank in Indianapolis, BF Goodrich radial tires. One of his first commercials in 1966 was for Goodyear. Packard Bell color televisions, Westinghouse appliances, Anison, Samsonite luggage, Volkswagens, Gulf Oil, Close-Up toothpaste. Serling actually introduced this product to the market. He also got paid for his public service announcements for the National Institute of Mental Health, CARE, which apparently is for Biafran refugees, Epilepsy Foundation of America, United Crusade, the Des Moines Police Association, the Save the Children Foundation. He recorded messages for the Los Angeles Urban Coalition free of charge. He did at least one free of charge.
Wow. So he's in LA, and he probably has an agent, a manager, and he says, I'll do anything. I'll do any ad, throw me in there. I'm a personality. Yeah. Was this a case of wanting to be in everybody's home still after the Twilight Zone ends? He wants to stay relevant.
Yeah, he would say it was for money, but I kind of don't think it was for money as much as it was for staying in the public eye, staying in people's attention and all that kind of thing.
$3 million. I mean, you got to figure after taxes, what did he make? He must have made, what is that? It's going to be worth $40 or $50 million now, something like that, right?
Well, I'm sorry. I was saying that in current.
Oh, in current. Okay, well, still.
It's still a chunk of money, but the thing is, he'd been just stacking paper. Like, he'd been making, thousands of dollars a week in those days, dollars for years at that point.
In the Twilight Zone, I'm going back and I'm screaming at Rod Serling, buy Dogecoin, buy Dogecoin early. And he's like, what the hell are you talking about?
Why would I buy it? Yeah. What is a
crazy 6'1" guy from the Midwest is screaming at him in Hollywood.
Yeah, I'm going to finish this quote because it's got a good end point to it. So this is still about the advertising. Despite all the offers that rolled in for his services, which he authorized the agency to accept contingent only on price, Serling wanted more. He told his friend Al Weissman at the advertising agency Foote, Cone, and Belding that he wanted to be considered for every commercial possible. I have passed your name on to a number of people in the organization, Weissman responded with some disinclination. If that's what you want, so be it. Evidently, his taste standards excluded only, and this is Serling, evidently only Serling's taste standards excluded only housewife products like floor wax and hair coloring. That is, if he had to be seen on camera. Voiceovers were fine for these products.
Look, get that money.
Yeah, that's right.
Get paid.
I'm not against it, but it was like he wanted to be Arthur Miller. He wanted to be Ernest Hemingway.
He wanted to be Arthur Miller, and then he ended up being a guy who sold toothpaste.
Right.
I understand.
Right. There's something that crunches about that, right? Where it's like, and he kind of was. Like, if he would have slowed down for 5 minutes and rewritten a second draft of something, he could have been Arthur Miller.
He could have produced his own theater. He could have produced his own movies.
Right.
He could have written a screenplay. Right. I see what you're saying. Yeah. Again, it's that Fitzgerald problem where you're like, yes, Gatsby is better than anything that Hemingway wrote, but the body of Hemingway's work is greater than the body of Fitzgerald's work, in my opinion. And that's because Fitzgerald got pulled away. He went to write magazine stories and went to, I think even write television and all the rest.
Right. And so Serling's, this is 1965, Twilight Zone ends. The height of the commercial period was 1968 to 1969, while people still know him. He hosts a game show for a little while called the Liars Club, where celebrities would come on, and three of them would tell fake stories, and one of them would tell a real story, and Rod Serling had to determine which one was real. Which actually sounds like it might be kind of entertaining, because Rod Serling was a really funny affable, charismatic guy, right? Like he was fun to listen, talk to. He had a great voice. He had great stories. He was self-deprecating. You know, it was probably a pretty funny show. But it's not, again, he's not writing Death of a Salesman when you're going on a hosting a game show. He did, at this time, though, Twilight Zone over, he kind of assumed the best was behind him. He did start to drink more. He probably started carousing some more. He started tanning more intensively. He continued smoking just as much as he had been.
This is a man, he's trying to smoke and pickle himself.
Yeah. He had a ridiculous haircut in the early 70s, which I guess maybe everybody did. But it's like this coiffed mullet kind of thing. It's obviously too much. He does have some success after this. I mean, he still wins an Emmy after the Twilight Zone, possibly 2 Emmys, and is still he's still a guy who can get work, though he has less. He's not the angry young man of television anymore, and the medium is evolving to some extent. The kind of the last thing, not quite the last thing, but the last thing we're going to talk about him working on was a show called The Night Gallery, which was sort of like the Twilight Zone in that it was an anthology series focused more on horror. You would have several stories in one episode, but Rod Serling basically had no control. He would write scripts, they would get either rejected or so heavily modified that it's sort of, he didn't even recognize them anymore. He was sort of just there as the front man fundamentally. And what's crazy is he comes on I think it's Dick Cavett show. Watch this episode of the Dick Cavett show while Night Gallery is out, right? So he's supposed to be on a self-promotion tour.
Yeah.
And Rod Serling just says, I barely have anything to do with it. I don't even know why my name is on it.
He's doing a press junket and he sticks his foot in his mouth.
Yeah. He's just like, I don't really, maybe it'll be a good show. I don't know. But if it is, it won't be to my credit. I don't know. I don't know what's going on with it. So now this is in his 40s. This description I'm going to give you is a little bit before this Night Gallery time, but it's close enough, I think, to count.
I think one thing that might help people contextualize this too is that he was a big enough celebrity that he was on the Tonight Show.
Yes.
It looks like he was on the 19th episode of the Johnny Carson era of the Tonight Show. Yeah. So
yeah, he was a name
big
for sure. He was
A-list. Big time personality.
And for a writer, he was primarily a writer. There was nobody writing television except for maybe a couple comedians who were anywhere near the level of fame that this guy had.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, so this is a little bit earlier than this Night Gallery. Night Gallery was very early 70s, but this is from the biography again. Sadly, for this man of 41 who felt at least 51, time seemed to be in short supply. If he lingered over a single manuscript for a year or two and the manuscript still lacked distinction, he had no excuses for his failure. If, however, he wrote it quickly, rewriting as little as possible, he then had a ready-made excuse. Only writers who believe in their work, even if others don't grant themselves the time. Only writers who believe in their work, even if others don't, grant themselves the time. This was self-sabotage, a part of his personality that seems all the more pathetic because financially he could have afforded to take as much time as he wished. It was a shocking waste of a talent that should have been cultivated, not prostituted. He virtually guaranteed that he would end up writing for television, a medium he professed to avere. So
he sold out.
He did. Yeah, this is. I was looking for the darkness, and PTSD seemed like it, and the cigarette seemed like it, and the workaholism seemed like it, and then I kind of came into this and was like, "Dang, that might be the darkest one of all."
Spending a lot of time away from your family too. There's a quality there that's maybe not ideal. Did they ever move out to LA with him, or was it?
They did not, but just within the last 10 years, his daughter wrote a biography called something like "The Man I Knew," and she loved him, and she basically posed him as like the ideal father. So I think they did actually move out to LA, but I think there was this workaholism, but his personality, and he was a genuinely loving guy.
Well, then I think then the darkness, then I think you're right to home in on the that sellout quality of you have all the money in the world, you have all the fame in the world, but then you can't take 6 months and write your masterpiece. You
Right,
can't take a year and produce Death of a Salesman.
Right.
And maybe you never had it in you, or maybe you burned through the energy, because a lot of that stuff is a young man's game. It's a young person's game. A lot of that stuff.
Oh, and by
especially in show business.
Yes, and by 1970, he is out of ideas. Like the well is dry.
Right.
There are two things he made in the 70s. He almost got sued for plagiarism, and because they were like a friend of his who told these great stories, and everybody in Hollywood knew this guy. And like Serling kind of like it looks very much like Serling might have kind of just took parts of them. They weren't exactly what the guy, but pretty obviously.
Yeah, you need to be like Story Idea by Brad Kelly, Emmy Award-winning script by Kevin Couch.
There you go. Right.
But yeah, no, I know what you're saying.
Yeah. So by the end, it was like there wasn't a whole lot left in the tank. Now,
right. That is dark. If you aspire to be an artist like Arthur Miller, and then you end up becoming a carnival barker for toothpaste
and possibly
a long way
taking
down
other people's ideas,
right, and then becoming like a joke thief in comedy. That's pretty ugly. Tough to sleep at night.
Right. No, agreed. And, I think, he had gotten some vague accusations of plagiarism. One was early on the Twilight Zone period. One of them was by Ray Bradbury. And I looked at like the premises for the two things that were compared. And I don't think honestly, I don't really see it, the plagiarism in that case.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like one story was like they both just involved a person walking through a town where there wasn't anybody. But like, the plots were totally different. Ray Bradbury's was on a different planet. And
I had a dream like that once when I was a kid. I mean,
it's an archetypal kind of thing. It's like saying two war movies are plagiarized.
Sounds like Ray Bradbury was gold digging. Maybe had a lawyer. That Serling fellow is a hack.
Yeah, that's right. This is an interesting thing because Ray Bradbury was by far a better narrative writer in terms of writing books, and there was some relationship there with Rod Serling. But Rod Serling had a TV show kind of like the Twilight Zone that was garbage.
Wait, you mean Ray Bradbury?
I'm sorry, yes, Ray Bradbury did. I apologize.
Yeah,
and it was garbage. It was like the Ray Bradbury Spectacular or something like that. It was not good whatsoever. So Serling's show killed it. And Ray Bradbury's didn't. So
Ray Bradbury's show doesn't have a pinball machine.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Most people don't even know it existed. So, this is and I like kind of how you put that. Where like you were gonna write Death of a Salesman. You ended up selling soap, and maybe what makes this even sadder is that Serling probably did have the potential. You know what I mean?
He had the great American novel in him. He could have written the great Pulitzer-winning play.
Right. Like he almost did. He won Emmys and he made a show that would change culture and but he didn't quite get over that hump.
There's that great arc in The Sopranos where the TV writer gets caught up with the mob and he tries to pawn his Emmy, and the pawn guy's like, I can see if it was an Oscar, maybe. It's this kind of self-referential TV is trash. What are you talking about? Very funny. Very funny.
Yeah. So I had mentioned, it's like so I had mentioned he had this thing with his finger, numbness in his finger. It only got worse, and apparently this is something called Buerger's disease, Buerger, where if you smoke a lot, you will start to lose some circulation to your fingers. They told him he had to quit smoking, or they might have to amputate, which apparently they never ended up getting around to that. But he had a heart attack in 1975. He was only 50 years old. And he had a heart attack and he'd survived it. And he was kind of okay. And the doctor had sort of given him this regimen. He was supposed to have less stress. He was still pretty stressed because he was trying to write a lot, but there was just not a lot happening. He had taken these weird, this is one thing we missed in this attention thing. He was teaching courses at Ithaca College through a lot of this also. He took a sabbatical to Ithaca College, right? And during this, he traveled to Columbus, Ohio, or something like that. I can't remember what it was. But during this, while he was famous, Rod Serling, he got so bored and needed so much attention that he went and like was the MC for like movie night for a local channel. Like it would be like going to like the St. Paul, whatever, ABC is in St. Paul, going on. It's hard to describe exactly. Like, the city had its own broadcast.
Sure, yeah, it would be like local access. You go on a local access
sort
show
of,
or something, or you're a famous comedian and you go do some open mic in the suburb at the mall.
Yeah. So he would travel to the city. I think it was Columbus, and he would film these little things just so he could still be on TV. Like he just needed it. So anyway. This time, and he also did a lot of college tours. He would go speak on college campuses a lot, probably to meet. I don't know if he did that to meet girls or not.
Do we know, was there any hanky panky on the side? I mean, for a guy who was traveling and living away from his family,
nobody in the biography would really put a very fine point on it, but it kind of becomes clear that there was, especially as he got like older and sadder. And more,
just trying to fill that gap, trying to fill up that hole of
I mean, I think during the Twilight Zone, there's probably working too hard to even do, you know what I mean, just time wise. So now we're in the 70s. He's had a heart attack. He's traveling around. He's made all the money. He's got a lot of money. Now, shortly after the heart attack, a couple months later, they decide that he needs so the doctor prescribes less stress, which he tries to do, a little bit more exercise, which he tries to do, and cut the cigarettes out, which is not in his wheelhouse whatsoever. He's hiding cigarettes in trees, and he's like, he never really stopped smoking. And he's like he's a 4-pack a day kind of guy, which is, for anybody who hasn't smoked, 4 packs a day, if I were to translate it into coffee, it's like drinking 4 pots of coffee.
Yeah, 4 French press espresso pots of coffee with jet fuel espresso inside them. No cream, 4 big pots of iced coffee, pots of, Well, it's like that Bill Hicks joke, how much do you smoke a day? A pack a day. Oh, you're weak. I smoke, I go through 3 lighters a day, man. It's like 4 packs is you're getting to the point where you figure, what do they have, like 20, they got 20 cigarettes a piece. Is that right?
Yeah.
Is that about right?
80 cigarettes a day. You're smoking them pretty much
first constantly. In the morning. I'm trying to do some math. I mean, how many is that an hour? I mean, there are 12 hours a day, really. I mean, you're awake for 16 hours a day? Yeah. You do the math. I mean, you're pretty much constantly smoking.
Right.
If you're not smoking, you're actually doing something else with your hands, or you're eating.
Right. Yeah. So, you're in the shower.
Right. You're a cigarette with a human attached to it.
Yeah. So that's probably too many.
Right.
So anyway, so they bring him in. He continues having chest pains and things, and they decide to take him up to Rochester.
I can't figure out why I'm having these chest pains, doctor.
Meanwhile, Whew. So, and he's moved basically back to Cayuga Lake at this point, and they decide to take him up to Strong Memorial Hospital in Rochester. And I only mention that hospital because I've actually spent a lot of time in that hospital, weirdly enough, and not personally, but I've just been there. And they give him a bypass surgery, which in 1975 was like the new stuff. Not a lot of bypasses had been done yet. This was at the forefront of medical technology at the time.
I think a lot of that tech was developed at the University of Minnesota. Go Gophers!
Oh, that probably
a lot of heart, a lot of medical stuff happened in Minnesota.
Oh, good.
For what it's worth. There you go.
Cool, and it's a great procedure. I mean, it saved tons of people's lives. And at first, they believed it was going to be successful for Rod Serling. It seemed like it had all gone well, but when he woke up on the table, he had another heart attack. They decided to try and give him another bypass immediately, and part of the bypass surgery is they have to get part of an artery out of your leg. When they tried to pull that out, the artery basically fell apart because his veins, he basically had the veins, the doctor had said he had the veins of an 80-year-old man. And so that was it. He died at he wasn't quite 51. He was like 6 months from being 51.
He died rather young, didn't he?
Yeah.
So he kind of smoked. He worked himself to death. He smoked himself to death. He had another heart attack after having the bypass surgery.
On the table. Yeah.
On the table.
When he woke up. Yeah.
Oof.
Yeah.
Well, how long did he last after that?
Oh, that was it.
Oh, that
he died
got him.
in that. He went in for bypass surgery and he never came.
Oh,
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, 50, it's funny, man. 50 used to seem old to me, but you know, you and I are basically the same age. 50s starts to seem like it's not that old anymore. You know what I mean? Like,
oh yeah, dude.
It's
I don't
right
want
around
to
the
die
corner.
in 12 years.
I mean, yeah, it's 12 years. 12 years ago, I could legally drink. Like,
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, if I
Yeah.
was a grown man 12 years ago.
Well,
so
sort of.
Yeah.
I mean, you know.
Physiologically.
Right. I mean, in the eyes of the law, you were a fully developed adult human being, but we know better.
Right. But so, 50 is young. He looked like crap, though, I got to say.
Man.
Well, the tanning... The biography makes a big deal out of the tanning for whatever reason. I got to think the 4-packs probably made it look worse than the tanning.
Tanned a lot and smoked a lot, and sounds like he drank a fair bit.
Drank a bit. His diet probably was not great. You know.
Yeah. A lot of travel, a lot of work.
And if he was literally insomniac, probably not much sleep.
Thinking about different ways to mess with people.
Yeah.
With the Twilight Zone. Like that's your job, is to kind of mess with middle America as much as possible. There's a certain knowing that you're maybe not fulfilling your total artistic promise. Right. Although, of course, I mean, I don't want to talk smack. I mean, the Twilight Zone is this iconic, incredible accomplishment. But one wonders if he really felt that.
That's the thing, is I don't think that he did. I mean, I think he looked back and thought that he hadn't quite done it. You know, he had tried to make these Broadway plays because he thought that was had more artistic merit, and they never really worked.
But he was so wrong.
Right.
Really though, you wonder what he would. Well, and maybe I'm getting ahead of things. I mean, so have you brought us to the end of you brought us to the end of Rod Serling's life? And I want to say, Brad, that was really masterfully handled. I really enjoyed it. I feel like I got to know him.
Great.
You know, I enjoyed jumping around a little bit. I think it's interesting that you focus so much on his work. I had no idea that he was in the Pacific and that he saw action like that. I think a fascinating life. And if I pull anything out of it, it's similar to the Kubrick episode where I go, man, just sometimes you just got to grab it. You got to go in and say, darn it, you're giving me a job. I want to do this. We're going to do this way.
This is, and I saw real strong relationships to the Kubrick episode as well. And I feel like I'm pulling that out because I have to tell you, Kevin, maybe, this is more of a Patreon discussion, but like I've realized in doing this that like we are basically giving ourselves like a self-directed art history education here. Right. I mean, we're focusing on things you wouldn't focus on in art history, but like, I did see that relationship too. It was like these two men just talked their way into everything. Now they backed it up too. You had to be able to back it up.
Sure.
But like the talking themselves into it was hugely important. And I'm just waiting to see. I could just find somebody to talk my way into something.
You just got to keep going. You got to keep doing the podcast.
I'm going to go to podcast headquarters.
Right. I'm going directly to Joe Rogan, and I am demanding that we start to get the numbers for Art of Darkness that we deserve. Artofdarkpod.com, at Art of Darkpod on the Bird website. We have a Patreon where we deconstruct every episode and we talk for an additional 20 or 30 minutes, and we'll be doing that shortly. But we end every episode with an inquiry, and I'll ask you, Brad, what do you think Rod Serling would be doing today if he was alive?
I think he would still be writing television. I don't think he would have ever bothered ultimately to master any other format. I think he was a television brained person. So that's fine. It's a perfectly respectable medium now.
He would probably have loved to see the quality and the fact that we're in this golden age of television and streaming. And one wonders, would he have been pulled into episodes maybe of Twin Peaks as a cameo, possibly. Right. That lineage, the X-Files directly, you can point right back. I mean, a huge cultural footprint that he left with that show.
And you're right about Black Mirror too, like that. They redid Twilight Zone, and I only saw one episode, and it seemed to be pretty good. I didn't bother to. It's on one of the more obscure streaming sites, so I didn't watch the rest of them.
So he's writing television, and it sounds like he would also be justice minded. He would be socially minded, so he might fit right in, kind of into the milieu now.
Yeah, I think he would find the current. I don't know exactly what side of things he would fall on. in any particular issue, but I think he would find it exciting for sure. Yeah.
Great. Well, that was a lot of fun, Brad. Great. I'm excited. I haven't landed on who I'm going to do next. I think it might be. Yeah, I think I'm going to have to do Tennessee Williams at some juncture. So it may be Tennessee.
Oh, that's a great subject.
That's going to be a good one. I want to do it justice, and I want to give it enough time. But this has been Art of Darkness, and Brad, again, a lot of fun. If you're into the show, follow us on Patreon. You get extra episodes, another 20 or 30 minutes. We're going to talk a little more about Rod Serling and how Brad researched this and all the rest. And is there anything else you want to say to people, Brad?
No, I don't think so. Go back and watch some Twilight Zone. It's a Good Life is maybe my favorite. That's the one with the little boy monster. But, honestly, just scroll through the premises you can explain in a sentence. If you find a cool one, watch it. I think they're great. So.
I'm going to see if I can find the It's a Good Life intro and dump that into the end of this episode. Yeah. So, all right.
That'd be great.
artofdarkpod.com. Brad, I'll see you on the Patreon.
All right. See you in a minute, sir.
You're traveling through another dimension. A dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination. Your next stop, the Twilight Zone. Tonight's story on the Twilight Zone is somewhat unique and calls for a different kind of introduction. This, as you may recognize, is a map of the United States, and there's a little town there called Peaksville. On a given morning not too long ago, the rest of the world disappeared, and Peaksville was left all alone. Its inhabitants were never sure whether the world was destroyed and only Peaksville left untouched, or whether the village had somehow been taken away. They were, on the other hand, sure of one thing, the cause. A monster had arrived in the village. Just by using his mind, he took away the automobiles, the electricity, the machines, because they displeased him. And he moved an entire community back into the Dark Ages, just by using his mind. Now I'd like to introduce you to some of the people in Peaksville, Ohio. This is Mr. Fremont. It's in his farmhouse that the monster resides. This is Mrs. Fremont. And this is Aunt Amy, who probably had more control over the monster in the beginning than almost anyone. But one day she forgot. She began to sing aloud. Now the monster doesn't like singing, so his mind snapped at her and turned her into the smiling, vacant thing you're looking at now. She sings no more. And you'll note that the people in Peaksville, Ohio, have to smile. They have to think happy thoughts and say happy things, because once displeased, the monster can wish them into a cornfield or change them into a grotesque walking horror. This particular monster can read minds, you see. He knows every thought. He can feel every emotion. Oh, yes, I did forget something, didn't I? I forgot to introduce you to the monster. This is the monster. His name is Anthony Fremont. He's 6 years old with a cute little boy face and blue, guileless eyes. But when those eyes look at you, you'd better start thinking happy thoughts, because the mind behind them is absolutely in charge. This is the Twilight Zone.